Today I'm joined by Dr Sarah Sibson, a GP with a special interest in women's health and neurodivergence in adults. Sarah founded the Neurodivergent Collective to challenge the stigma associated with conditions like autism, ADHD and OCD, and to empower women by pushing for more awareness, acceptance and positive change. In my GP practice, I see so many women who have lived their lives without a diagnosis or discovery, and it might not be until they reach the perimenopause that symptoms are unmasked and diagnosed, which often comes with a huge amount of relief and understanding. Today we're unpacking what it means to be neurodivergent, the different ways it can show up, and why so many women are missed within our healthcare system. Let's get into it. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I would love you to tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about you and how you've ended up with a special interest in this area.
Well, I am a GP by training. So I am an Adelaide-based neurodivergent person myself. So you can see the thought processing of my face sometimes. And I moved through life in a completely different headspace. And it wasn't until I had finished university and finished specialty training and moved out into the workforce as a GP that I finally realized my neurotype was not what I had thought it was. So I was diagnosed with ADHD at 37. And that prompted a complete 180 in my life in a number of areas as well. So from that point, I moved into working for myself and am running my own business and loving it. It's a great fit for me now that I know who I am more than I did to start. So that's probably it in a nutshell.
Okay, so that's really interesting because I have to say I work a lot with perimenopausal women, and I'm definitely having more and more presenting, wondering whether they have ADHD or whether they're on the autism spectrum, sometimes driven because of their children being diagnosed, and as they're filling in questionnaires and booklets for their kids, they're kind of thinking, oh, that's me. Actually, that this questionnaire is actually talking about me. So they're thinking it's them. But I've also had a group, which I have to say that phrase has come up a few times, of saying that they don't really know who they are and that they feel like they've always kind of bent and molded themselves to try and fit in with various groups. And obviously I'm just one little part-time GP. So it's not like I'm seeing thousands of patients, probably have over the last 20 years, but is that a phrase that you would hear people say, that they one of the feelings are they just not sure exactly who they are?
I'd say that is a pretty common experience, and sometimes it can be even difficult to put words to what doesn't feel right. You just know that something isn't right, but you couldn't if someone asked you specifically, it would be very tough to say what that feeling of unease might be. So there are some people that have been fortunate enough to understand more about neurodivergence based on their life experience and very easily identify that in life. But for people that don't have that around them or that understanding, then it can just feel like a disconnect from knowing your own desires and needs and being able to express them well so that other people can meet you where you are. And I think that can be really tough to get to the point where you have an understanding, if it's even that difficult to express what doesn't feel right in the first place.
Can we step back? So for anyone watching or listening, we can really clarify a few things. So what is autism? What is ADHD? And what is neurodivergence? Like, what do those things all mean? If you would explain, that would be wonderful.
Happy to. So I'll start with neurodivergence because I think it helps us frame the full conversation around that. So when we talk about I said neurotype earlier, and that feeds into this discussion in that it's an understanding of the type of brain that you have. So everybody has one if they're human, and we all sit on a spectrum of difference in the same way that we have different eye colors and different hair colors. We also have different brain types. And the discussion of neurodiversity is the full range of brains. So everybody that would consider themselves to have the standard kind of majority brain type through to people that have a brain that varies from that. And that is what neurodivergence is. So any brain that is considered to be different from the majority, and that can happen in a whole bunch of different ways. So the most common discussion you hear around neurodivergence is usually autism and ADHD, but there's a whole big list of brain types that also fall under that big umbrella of neurodivergence. And then when we get into the ADHD side of things, it really is an experience of a brain that has a different way of regulating and coordinating processes that we call executive functions. So that's the stuff in your brain that helps you with organization and planning and regulation of emotions and sensory things. And it has to do a lot with focus, which is where the name comes from. So the A in ADHD is attention, but I think it's a misnomer in that it's often not an attention deficit like the name might suggest. It's more a difficulty in focusing that attention in on the thing that either you want it to do or someone else wants it to do. So I think of it more as a difference in direction of attention. And when it comes to autism, that experience is extremely varied. Not that ADHD isn't, but it's even more so, I find, in that it covers not only executive function differences, but also sensory inputs. So coming into the body, those sensory things like light and sound and touch and temperature, the whole spectrum of senses can be interpreted differently in your body. And then it can also link into how those inputs that you experience through day-to-day life are interpreted and kind of constructed in your brain. And then also how you interact with the world as a result of all of that. So there's a lot of times where people might label an autistic person as socially disconnected or awkward or unable to communicate properly. And I'll put that in air quotes because that's a whole nother subject. But it has more to do with the full range of experience of incoming, processing, and outgoing information and experience of the world.
Is your practice focused primarily on women, or is it for everyone, or do you have a specific focus?
Yeah, so my background is in women's health, and that's my passion as well because of my experience personally and professionally about the disparity between healthcare for women and non-cis men in the medical system, essentially. So my focus is on that, and I work a lot from lived experience as well. So obviously, identifying as a woman, that means I am most in tune with that experience, but not limited. I don't say that you have to be a particular gender to work with me. I'm happy to see everybody.
And so one of the things that I think people can get a little bit confused around, if we talk a little bit about ADHD first, is, and I know I was definitely guilty of this, one of my children has ADHD, and I initially thought, oh, well, he couldn't possibly have ADHD because he can focus for hours on the TV, or he can focus for hours on his iPad, or he can focus for hours on Lego. So clearly he doesn't have an attention problem. And so I'll completely fess up to that one. I completely got that wrong. But I think that's definitely, I think you're right. The name ADHD is probably not the best name, because I think it makes people think, well, well, if someone can focus on it playing Minecraft, or they can focus on doing X, Y, or Z, then it must mean that they don't have ADHD, because they clearly do have good concentration. But in reality, it means that they have concentration for things that really interest them or are appealing, but actually things that are probably really boring. Probably for everyone, they're reasonably boring, but they just will struggle to actually do those things. So that's definitely one of the lessons that I've learned. And I definitely, even as a doctor, didn't know that before. But are there any other things that you feel that people have got wrong, or that are maybe surprised by?
That's an excellent question. First, I'd like to say thank you for expressing what you just did, because I like to call ADHD an interest-based brain. And so, like you described, the interesting things you're amazingly focused on, and the boring things, not so much. I would say, as far as other experiences of ADHD that are less well understood or even known, I really would focus on the emotional part of it. It has a huge impact for people that are neurodivergent in general. And in ADHD, the fluctuations and the strength and the intensity of emotions can be really overwhelming at times. And if you don't understand that about yourself and your system, then it can be a very big barrier for interacting with others and how your relationships play out with family, friends, significant others. It just something that has a wide-ranging impact, but is not as often spoken about, because everyone's so focused on the attention and the organization and accomplishment side of things.
You're absolutely right. I think emotional regulation is nearly probably one of the most difficult symptoms or difficulties that people can have, because we are set up as a society that everyone's going to conform and behave in a certain way at school or at sport or whatever. And there's no doubt that, even speaking from personal experience within my family, some of those things are really much more challenging. And as someone who didn't have that type of brain, I just couldn't understand, why my son found it just so difficult. Yeah, why will you not listen? And why can you not just do X, Y, or Z? And clearly, there is absolutely no doubt that he didn't want to displease people. He got very sad when people were displeased with him. He felt awful inside about people being angry with him. But in that moment, that emotional regulation just isn't there. And I think in a child anyway, that's challenging for all children. But I think when you've got ADHD, but I think as an adult with ADHD, how does that look?
Well, it doesn't go away. You just get better at meeting people's expectations about how you're going to behave. So I would say, particularly as a woman, that means it turns inward. So all of that, lability in emotional experience and the big responses, reactions to things, instead of just letting them flow out like kids tend to do, they go inside. And I think that has a very large part to do with why so many adults, and in particular women, with symptoms of things like anxiety and depression that are not responding to our normal approaches to those things, are the people that we as clinicians really need to be asking ourselves whether or not they have neurodivergent experience of, either ADHD or autism or any other thing that falls under that umbrella, because that, to me, is one of the number one alert bells that can go off if you're essentially stuffing all of your genuine emotions and thoughts and responses to things down inside because they're not considered acceptable. Then of course you're going to feel like rubbish. So I would say that's the number one thing I see play out for a lot of adults that are ADHDers, and working very hard to meet the expectations of others in how they respond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've definitely come across a few patients where they really haven't been responding to typical treatment for anxiety and depression. And it really is only whenever we've sort of discovered that they are neurodivergent and really address that, then we've seen really great progress. But until that point, we were cycling, myself and multiple psychiatrists cycling through multiple medications and therapies and psychologists. But I think once we actually discovered what was perhaps at the root of it all, and trying to, fit a square peg in a round hole, as it were, then once we took that pressure off and maybe educated the person themselves and also everyone around them a little bit more, I feel like nearly all of them, their mood improved really quite substantially and quite quickly. And I think it's also really interesting, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about this because you're much more of an expert in this field than me, but I do think that people who are neurodivergent seem to be overrepresented with eating disorders and gender dysphoria and sort of lots of other things that we would see as GPs. And I just wondered whether, again, is that just a case of suppressing lots of emotional, lability that it's coming out in different ways, or do we know why people seem to have more of those problems?
Well, those two that you mentioned in particular. So I will focus in on the eating disorder side of things because that is definitely a well-recognized co-occurring experience that is disproportionately represented in the neurodivergent population. It can be for a few different reasons, I think. But as far as the biology of it, it makes a lot of sense that someone who feels disconnected and unhappy and struggles to be themselves in their day-to-day life would find other ways to try and fill those holes that you feel as a result of that. And I think some people will go to the dopamine seeking side of things with eating disorders and end up with the high prevalence of binge eating and related eating disorders because of what's going on in the brain and that desire for dopamine. They're looking for it in so many ways that seems to be very disproportionately represented. And then I think the other side of that coin is the desire for control and trying to control something in your life and have something that goes the way you expect and something that, doesn't clash with your expectations is safer in many ways. So I think the elements of eating disorders that have to do more with that, which we would usually link with things along the anorexia spectrum, seem to be more of that kind of drive behind it. So it's a varied cluster of things anyway, but I think how neurodivergence interplays with all of that is even nuanced again. And with any of these kinds of situations, it all depends on the individual in front of you anyway, and what their experience is, and how we can best help people navigate, the relationship with food or their understanding of their own gender, which there's definitely a large proportion of people that are gender fluid or gender discordant as far as, what society labels them, and that are also neurodivergent. There seems to be a much higher proportion of people in the neurodivergent community that identify as non-cisgendered individuals. And it's very, very hard to say why in that instance, because gender is such a personal experience. But I suspect it's that people that are neurodivergent are much more likely to have asked themselves questions about their experience of life because they're trying to figure it out so often that they then come across that gender question and they've even thought about it and decided how they felt about that and what their experience is. So, and that one I won't give you a solid answer on because I think it is a very individual situation for that particular one.
Oh, absolutely. And so if we still just talking about ADHD, but how did women present differently to men, or why have we for years not thought that like young girls have ADHD? What is it that's so different between a boy versus a girl that we seem to be missing all these diagnoses?
That's a very, very important question to my heart, because that is a bit of a mission for me to just have people understand that difference better, not only as clinicians and people that are caring for these humans, but also the people themselves, so that they can at least understand that difference and how it applies to them. So I would say before puberty, we see a bit less difference between genders because there is less interplay of hormones in the system. And once you get into puberty and beyond, then we see that difference is quite significant, I would say, in my practice. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of research about this, no surprise, to be able to answer with any kind of certainty. But what I would say is that in general, if we're going to put gender overlapping the experience of the different kinds of ADHD that we're aware of, the boys tend to have a more hyperactive experience and the girls tend to have a more inattentive experience. So when you're talking about the official diagnostic criteria in the DSM, they separate it out into those two categories. And then there's a third of combined, which is a mixture of experiences in both of those other two. And you can imagine in a classroom, the hyperactive child, boy or girl, is going to be the one that gets noticed because they're the one bouncing around disrupting everybody. But if you're a kid that has the inattentive experience of ADHD, where you're quiet and not disrupting everybody, but unable to focus and sustain attention on your schoolwork, or get started on schoolwork that feels boring or unappealing to you, or any number of things that are a much more internalized experience, then you can see why it slips under the radar, because it doesn't make waves for anybody else. It's just a really tough time for you on the inside. So when we're looking at the experience based on gender, it does appear that girls and women are more likely to have the inattentive subtype of ADHD, but that isn't necessarily a hard and fast rule. So there are plenty of people that I know that are women and are the classic external hyperactivity experience. And then there's also the discussion around the internal hyperactivity, which I think is probably a better way to describe that inattentive label anyway, because it's the people whose thoughts are racing continuously and the people who struggle to stay on one train of thought because they've got so many great thoughts and they just chase them down as they come up and are struggling to hold on to any one particular one. Or the people who feel, it's commonly said the phrase, kind of driven or like pressured, or like you have an engine running inside of you, but it's not necessarily seen on the outside. So I'd say, in my mind, I almost call them external hyperactivity and internal hyperactivity. And as women and girls, we're much more likely to have the latter.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. So in your classical, and I know it's only classical, but you've got your hyperactive boy and your daydreamer girl, and staring out the window and being told off for not paying attention more than being sort of naughty or disruptive. But then as you get older, it's often that they have that internal dialogue that's just almost constant and they're full of ideas and ready to move on to the next thing. I mean, there's probably a reason why they say that people who are neurodivergent are much more likely to be entrepreneurial and things, because they have lots of great ideas. And it's the ones who manage to execute the idea before they move on to the next one. They're probably the real successes in terms of being millionaires and billionaires. Yeah,
it's that whole task completion thing that's the struggle. It's not that you don't have a great business. It's just that you don't see it through.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, I was listening to actually a podcast with Professor Tony Atwood, and he was talking a lot about, whether, all of these different types of brains have been sort of labeled as disorders or conditions, but and diagnosed as if it's like an illness. But in actual fact, is it really just that we expect everyone to be this way X, but actually this person wants to be B, and we're just trying to make everybody too much alike? And he was saying that he likes to talk about discovering autism or discovering ADHD as opposed to diagnosing it, because it's not, it's often got lots of advantages actually to have this type of brain. So I would love to talk to that, because I think that it can be something that's always framed quite negatively. And yes, people will throw out, the Elon Musks or whatever of the world and say, oh, look, these couple of very successful people, but they will then continue to refer back to this being nearly like a problem. But maybe the problem actually is that we're just not accommodating enough, and we're not accepting enough of all the riches. But I'd love you to speak to both in terms of not necessarily just about yourself, but also some of the amazing people that you've met over the years, and how that there can be sort of benefits or advantages to this type of brain.
Absolutely. I think I love the discovery idea of the verb instead of diagnosing. And I often hear recognition. So it's all those things of, it's already there. It's intrinsic. It's that person, and that's the brain they were born with. It's not a disorder or a diagnosis to be had. So I think that is crucial in our understanding and moving forward of better getting in touch with all of the wonderful things that can come with these variants of brain type. And I think it has a lot to do with the expectations of our society that we're in, and most Western societies, in my experience, of productivity and achievement being our number one goals and things we're meant to be aiming for. And neurodivergent brains aren't necessarily wired to be the best in those classical systems. They can be absolutely incredible when they're in the right environment for them. So just trying to cram everybody into the same box very rarely works, no matter what you're talking about. And this is no different. I would say that a phrase I said in a different interview that really stood out to people and really honed in on the essence of ADHD superpowers, as some people call them, is I know exactly who I would want to have with me in a zombie apocalypse. It would be ADHDers, and not the boring, stick to the rules, only do what is asked of me approach that is encouraged of a lot of us. It's the people that in a crisis or under pressure shine the brightest and do their best, because they have that whole huge variety of creative ideas and innovative way of looking at problems and coming up with solutions that might seem disparate to other ways of thinking. So connecting lots of dots that don't necessarily on the surface look like they go together. And also, I think that can flow into so many different arenas in life as well. So not simply in a work environment, but in your pursuit of your hobbies and your interests. I know a lot of ADHDers have a hobby closet because they have tried so many of them and they love them, but they don't necessarily finish them all or stick to them for very long. So it's just the idea that finishing everything is the right way to do it in life. Why is it not the right way for some people to try all those hobbies and love them while they're doing them and then be done with them? I think that's the concepts that we function under define success and ability a little bit too narrowly. So those would be big ones that I'd say for ADHD. And a lot of my autistic friends and clients, I would say it's that deep, rich interest that can be pursued to the ends of the earth If it's something that interests you, you become a complete expert in it and can just enrich any discussion that falls under your kind of banner of knowledge. And the other thing I will say is there's a lot of discussion around autistic people having a lack of empathy or a lack of connection with others or that kind of thing. But in my experience, it's actually the opposite. It's just that that autistic person doesn't necessarily communicate their experience of that in the way you expect them to. So I find that autistic folks tend to have a really strong sense of justice and will stand up for other people, to their own detriment when other people might just shy away and keep going. Whereas autistic people in general, I would say, have very big hearts and want to see others be happy and have a good experience as well. So it's, again, the expectations of how we interact with our systems and structures around us that lead to that misinterpretation. Whereas underneath all of it, I think there's some really amazing qualities that are strengths in neurodivergent people.
I agree. I have a number of women who have come in to see me, and they've maybe had one of their children be diagnosed with autism, and as I say, they're thinking lots of the questionnaire seems to apply to them as well. But they'll say things like, but I can't have autism because I'm really empathetic, or I can't have autism because I've got really good eye contact, or I can't have autism because I'm very affectionate with my children. And so it's like people have this stereotype that someone with autism is walking along with their eyes cast to the ground, and they're the person who won't hug anybody, and that they and there really is a stereotype of what and I think it's we're going to have to work really, really hard to break that down, because I think so many people probably are neurodivergent, but they have this very firm idea of what it means. I've got eye contact, so I can't be autistic. I'm affectionate with my children, I can't be autistic. I'm empathetic, I can't be autistic, whenever that is clearly not the truth at all. And as you said, I have to say the sense of justice, or the frustration of a lack of justice, is something that I see both in my own family, but even with kids that I see coming into the GP practice. They get so annoyed if something they perceive isn't fair, and they will sort of struggle to give up on it, because the lack of fairness is really hard for them to comprehend. And even if the fairness is to their advantage, they will actually still speak up and say, no, but that wouldn't be fair on my brother or whatever. So I think you definitely nailed it. I think sense of justice is definitely a different way of showing empathy to people, but it's actually a really true way as well. So if we think about women presenting a bit in later life, what's the advantage of getting a discovery or a diagnosis? Like, what's the benefit of maybe knowing?
There isn't always a benefit. I will say that, which is maybe a bit of an unpopular opinion. But it's when people ask me if they should pursue a diagnosis or pursue an assessment and discovery, as I'm going to have to use that word, I like it a lot better, then my answer is usually, what are you hoping to gain in the process? Do you have interest in accessing medication that will help you in your brain? Or do you have interest in accessing supports that would be really beneficial? Or is it for the purpose of understanding yourself and how you work and better able to address work or home, or it's a very individual reason that someone might be pursuing a discovery. And I feel like not all the time is having that official label a useful thing. It's really to access the system supports and understanding that you need from others where I find it's useful. But as far as determining who you are, that's an internal discussion that has nothing to do with anybody else. So if it's to access things like a learning assessment or NDIS support, then yeah, absolutely. I think it's a worthwhile process to go through. And the other thing I would say is that don't get too caught up on the labels either, because what one person thinks is your label, another person might disagree with. So, if the response from the people that you're seeing in a professional capacity to do that assessment and have the diagnosis doesn't match your experience of life, then that's okay. You can thank them for their answer and you can move on. You don't have to incorporate it. So I think, like you said about the whole discussion around, oh, well, I make eye contact, so I can't be autistic. Well, what else about your experience of life feels like that fits really well with autism and that brain type? Because like all human things, there's no black and white. There's no XYZ means you're autistic and, ABC means you aren't. It's a very dynamic process and experience. And sometimes communicating your internal experience to the person doing that assessment can also be a challenge, particularly because of neurodivergence and how the brain works in that instance. So those are my ramblings on that. If there was another part to the question that I have forgotten, please feel free to remind me. %, yeah, without a doubt. So the vast majority of any kind of questionnaire or measure that is commonly used in practice for adults, it has come from data on kids, in particular male kids. So for a perimenopausal woman, the experience is vastly different. And I don't think that they're, at least the ones in standard use, they don't necessarily translate as well as we think they do. So if you have gone through the process using one of those standard ones and someone's come back and said, no, not ADHD, not autistic because of this questionnaire, then I don't necessarily think that that is the whole truth about that scenario. There are groups that are working to design better questionnaires and better diagnostic tools that are more relevant for adults just in general, as opposed to translating kids' information to bigger kids. And then there is also work on understanding that difference that gender and also hormonal kind of milieu in the system, depending, whatever your gender is, the estrogen dominant systems behave very differently to the testosterone dominant systems in neurodivergence. And we barely understand those differences, let alone are we able to assess for them in those processes yet. So I think it's a real challenge, and it probably top of the list for a lot of people to try and develop tools that are more useful in that case.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked before on this podcast before about the collision of the perimenopause and potentially an undiscovered diagnosis of ADHD, and how probably, there's lots of theories behind it. But, one of the theories sort of is that this person has probably been managing just about, and then add in all the sort of hormonal dysregulation that you get nearly like the form of a teenage brain again, where hormone levels are all over the place. And it's like the juggling act, just everything falls apart and people feel like they just are no longer coping and everything is sort of piling in on top of them. Is that a group of women that you're seeing present for diagnosis as well?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an understanding that made my interaction with the process of neurodivergence as a clinician a lot easier to kind of navigate because of that. You think someone, well, they've made it to 40 or 50 or whatever marker in their life, and why are we talking about this now? It's a social media trend, it's TikTok or whatever rubbish that people want to believe. But I find that it's a constant dance between the capacity you have to do the things that are expected of you and things that you want to do, and the demands that are placed on your system. And that's true for everybody, no matter your brain type. But in neurodivergence, there are key points where those demands spike and your capacity to meet them changes, because your life is different at 15 versus 50, and the demands placed on you are different, and the support structures are different. And it is a very, very common time for women to find that it feels like everything just falls apart around them if they're neurodivergent. And the other time that I would highlight is also in and around pregnancy, and after babies are newly born is another time where things just escalate precipitously as far as demand goes, and the capacity gets outstripped really, really easily. So those times as providers, if you're seeing women that are perimenopausal or around pregnancy or looking to conceive and going through the process of IVF, for instance, there's another demand. And that's a key time for the strategies that have worked for however long and to stop working.
And just sorry, on a side note, in terms of pregnancy and breastfeeding, I know we're not going into specifics, but can you still take your stimulant medication, for example? So if you've been put on medication for ADHD, is that something that you're allowed to take in pregnancy, or does that all have to stop?
Now, there is a can of worms, because there's not very much data. Let's just, I'll start there, because the concept that an adult that is female has ADHD and wants to be on medication, therefore might like to understand whether or not, as a woman who is of childbearing age, whether or not she would like to continue that in pregnancy or breastfeeding. It's not really a question that was asked until now. So the classic thing, like with a lot of medications in pregnancy and breastfeeding, is we have more retrospective information about people who have ended up being on those medications while pregnant or breastfeeding, and we can look at what the outcomes have been in that scenario. Overall, it is a very personal choice, because we don't have the research to back up our recommendations to people. So I often find is that particular person's choice about, we think it's probably safe. We think you're much more likely to handle the stresses of pregnancy and labor and birth of the baby and the first however many weeks where you're not sleeping and all of these things, if you are also able to regulate better because you're using your medication, or able to achieve things in the outside world that help support you because you're taking your medication. So it's a very nuanced discussion with each individual person, because we don't have robust kind of professional knowledge to support any specific recommendation.
And just thinking back to something else that has been commented to me by a couple of patients, they've said, can't have autism because I've got friends. And we know that definitely sometimes social things can be trickier for people with autism, and there's definitely we've all read the stories and had the patients where they've been bullied or excluded, and there's definitely an increased risk and rate of that. But again, there's plenty of people with autism who've got friends and good friends and lots of friends. I just wonder what your thoughts on how we're going to start to break some of these stereotypes down about what it means to have autism.
That's an excellent question. I think it takes everybody, the autistic person and the non-autistic person, to drop their expectations about what a relationship or conversation or whatever that dynamic looks like between someone who is neurodivergent and someone who isn't. Because up until now, and probably will continue a while until this becomes more mainstream, our expectation of interactions and relationships are all based around neurotypical brains and how those brains like to interact with each other. But there's a lot of work to show that neurodivergent brains, even varying types of neurodivergence, so autism, ADHD, and other perspectives, they tend to have zero trouble communicating with each other, forming lasting, strong relationships with each other, and having lifelong friendships that are very nourishing. But if you then translate that across to a neurotypical person and their expectations of how a relationship goes, it doesn't look how they expect. And so they just assume that the autistic person doesn't do it. Whereas it's, I think it's the perspective shift that's really going to help there, is how is this person expressing to me in their words or their actions that shows me that they do care and they are invested in our friendship or romance or whatever, but aren't necessarily the way I expect those things to be turning out. So it's just kind of checking in all the time with yourself and the stories that you tell yourself about how things are supposed to go. And that will really help, I think, have people meet in the middle a bit better when it comes to all of those interpersonal interactions.
Can you give me some examples of sort of if someone's in a relationship with a partner, what are the things that they might need to change their expectations around a little bit? Can you give me a few examples?
Absolutely. Oh gosh, the list is long, so it's hard to pick some. But I would say, for instance, the relationship where you feel like you're nagging all the time, and the other person is, if you're putting the kind of the labels on it that are often there, the other person isn't doing what you asked, and they're not invested, they don't care, all that kind of very value-driven discussions around the interplay. Whereas maybe you asked your partner to take out the trash and they forgot because they were actually in their shed or their office doing that project that they're really interested in and they're super excited to show you because they know it's really going to help you and they're doing it because they really care. But meanwhile, you're over here mad about the trash. So I think it's just giving people a bit more grace is the number one thing. If it's someone that you believe cares for you genuinely, then not putting those labels and judgments on actions, just letting the person speak for themselves. Say, do you remember that I asked you to take out the trash? And they'll say, oh, I totally forgot. I'm so sorry. And they'll go do it. Instead of, why can't you take out the trash? You don't listen to me. You hate me. Rah, rah, rah. Just one of squillions of possible examples. So I would say, instead of assuming someone's intent, probably the best way to start a conversation where there's a mismatch is to just ask them what their experience was or what their thought process was or why there's that friction on whatever the matter is.
I had another example where a patient explained to me recently, so her husband has an autism diagnosis and they had a big argument over something to do with their children. And he kind of was angry, she was angry, and then she wanted them to kind of come together and kind of make up. And she said that she wanted to sort of sit beside him and sort of cuddle with him, but he was just like, no, you just need to, don't touch me, you need to just leave me alone. And I could see her point of view. She was so offended and she was quite distressed actually when she came to see me about it all and how were they ever going to reconnect. But I think just knowing what I know is that I think he just needed to de-escalate, and there'd been this big emotional thing, and he probably just needed some alone time, and probably not to have that sensory overload of touch after lots of shouting and arguing. Is that kind of roughly right?
100%, I would say, in that scenario you're describing. And it can look very differently and can hurt quite a lot if on the outside how someone's behaving feels like means they don't care or aren't invested or don't want the same things that you want. And I would say for that partner in that instance, it's exactly what you described. Just had a very stressful interaction with someone you care about, and conflict can be a real trigger for people who are neurodivergent because of their life experience up to that point. And even though the argument may have settled to a certain degree, it can take quite a while for a neurodivergent nervous system to get to the point where they're able to and want to engage in any other form of conversation or have any other sensory inputs like touch or being close to another person. It can be a very different incorporation process after conflict than you might expect.
What about, do you have any advice whenever you're working with women about, how they might approach this with their boss or their work colleagues if they're struggling at work?
Yeah, that's a really challenging situation, I think, because that also involves whether or not you want to disclose your neurotype at work, because there is still so much stigma that people, very rightly so, can be worried about saying I am autistic or I'm an ADHDer and that's why I have these needs. So a ADHD coach that I've worked with has given really great advice, I think, in that you don't necessarily have to give people your label to get the help that you need in that scenario. So it may more look like something along the lines of, I struggle to stay focused on my work if I am in a noisy space. So could I possibly have an office or a cubicle that is outside of the main area where I'm able to limit my distractions so I can do better work, or anything along those lines. So describing the difficulty and a way that you can recognize that would be helpful and present the options to whoever you're speaking to, a colleague or a boss, and ask for them to help you with it. Because I think while that can sound very much like putting the burden on the person who is feeling disabled by the system they're in, the where we are now and expecting a office environment or a boss or someone that doesn't understand neurodivergence to offer you good solutions or approach that conversation in a way that's going to result in success for everybody is not very likely at the minute, unfortunately. So I'd say talk to someone trusted beforehand that understands you and cares about you, and maybe figure out a few ways that you can ask for what you need and explain why it's going to be beneficial for everyone that you get that, so you can do your job, because you're very able to if you have the help you need.
Are there any things that you advise your patients with a diagnosis of autism not to do or to avoid?
Yes, the short answer is no. There's nothing I would say that someone should not do. It's probably more advice to them about expecting people to understand. And while it really sucks that people don't, and that really ties back into what we were talking before about justice and it being unfair, sometimes that is a hill you should not try and die on, because you're going to end up on the hill instead of on the other side. So that would be my answer to that.
I had a patient about a month ago, and I've known her for over 10 years. She's such a lovely person, but she has recently got married and she thinks she wants to have a baby with her husband, but she's really worried that because she's got autism that she's not going to be a good mom. And I chatted through this with another couple of GP colleagues, and they said they'd had similar presentations where people were really doubting their ability to be nurturing. And yet this same person has, a dog and 2 cats that she literally kills with kindness. So there's no doubt in my mind that she won't be exactly the same. But, I suppose, is that something that you notice that women with autism maybe don't have as much confidence in their abilities to do certain things?
Absolutely. Completely agree. Self-confidence, self-belief, and concepts of self-worth are very much huge pain points for people that are neurodivergent in general. There's a study that often gets quoted that says a ADHD kid, by the time they finish school, will have had something like, 40,000, I can't remember the exact number because that's not how my brain works, 40,000 more negative interactions or feedback with people around them than a neurotypical peer will have. So if your world is constantly telling you that you're rubbish in whatever way that it's doing that, then it's rare as hen's teeth to find someone on the other side that has managed to keep a really solid sense of self-worth despite all of that. So very, very common. I would say it's almost ubiquitous for everybody with a neurodivergent brain that there will be elements of believing what you've been told about yourself. So I think that's the number one thing, is to, in those moments where, this person that you're describing, I think you nailed it exactly. She is obviously loved and nurtured multiple pets, and they probably adore her, and is very capable of looking after another being and giving them what they need, but doesn't believe it because of all the stories that have come at her over her life. So I'd say anything to do with the concept of self and self-worth is very relevant in this discussion for neurodivergent people overall, but in particular women, because of the way we tend to interact with the world based on our gender as well. It's like a double whammy for us. So I'd say that can also be the most transformative and healing thing for people, is to start recognizing that and start identifying when those stories are coming up that you're just playing over and over, that you don't actually invest in or want to invest in. Maybe you still believe them, but want to change it. I think that's the biggest thing that can make a difference across the board, is to start looking at those things that you're saying, oh, well, I can't, or I'm autistic, so blah, or ADHDers can't do this. Well, is that true? What evidence do you have to support that, particularly in your own life, for you? I think that's a really helpful conversation to have with people when they feel stuck in a moment like that.
Is there any evidence to suggest that a neurodivergent brain is more, I suppose, susceptible to alcohol or drugs or not enough sleep or anything like that? Is there anything that people who have discovered these things about themselves need to be more cautious about?
I don't know of anything that says there's more susceptibility to the effects of things like that necessarily, but I would say there is definitely a very disproportionate amount of people who are neurodivergent who are represented in the addiction populations or the dependence populations. And that can be a huge number of reasons, kind of same as the eating disorder discussion, depends on the person's experience. But some of it is very likely to be seeking dopamine in whatever way possible. And that can be an additional difficulty then getting back out of that, because of all of the layers to it, which are different to a neurotypical brain that ends up with some kind of dependence. So I'd say in that space, that's probably more the consideration that I'm aware of, rather than being more susceptible to those things in the first place. It's more how you're more likely to go there because of your neurotype and struggle to get back out if you do.
Well, I suppose as well, if you've got that underlying of years of people being critical to you and possibly also having an increased risk of potentially being physically abused because you were naughty, add all that in and you're probably, it can be a bit of a recipe for an addiction, a propensity for addiction. I just have two last questions for you, which are, what's the one thing, or what would you love to get out there that people would understand a little bit more about women and autism, that maybe people don't know?
I think it's very difficult to get to the point of recognition of autism for yourself as a woman because of all of the information that we're fed around it. And I think it's also then very difficult to find a clinician that understands autism in women and have the support that you need from your healthcare providers because of all the things that they have been told and taught about it. And so what I would say is, if you're the person that thinks you may be autistic or knows that you are, because self-recognition is valid in my book, then it is okay to not listen to other people when they tell you that they don't believe that. Because it is only you, it is only your life, and no one else gets to tell you who you are. And for the clinicians, please listen to your patients. If someone tells you that that is their experience, then even if you personally don't align with that, you can still validate them in their experience. You don't have to negate it and tell someone they're wrong.
Hear, hear. I feel the same way about the perimenopause. Whenever people are told they don't have the perimenopause because they don't have hot flashes, I'm like,
yeah, exactly. A perfect translation, for everyone that's in your space. They're going to really resonate with that. If someone listening to this had a patient come in telling them that they'd been told they were in perimenopause because they had no hot flushes. Imagine your rage with that, and then translate it across to neurodivergence and someone being told that they aren't autistic because they can make eye contact.
Yeah, I know.
Same.
So frustrating. Okay, last question. Sarah, if you could give yourself, your 20-year-old self, a piece of advice, what would you tell 20-year-old Sarah?
I would tell her to trust her gut. And on the same theme that we are just talking about, your intuition is powerful. Your knowledge of yourself is powerful, and trusting that and acting on that rather than all of the noise around you and in your own head is going to be the thing that brings you the most joy.
Awesome. I love that. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. You've been so generous with your knowledge. Hopefully I haven't exhausted you too much.
Oh, no, that's fine. I mean, I could talk forever about this. This is my interest, so I am having a good time.
When I started this podcast back in December 23, I knew that I was lucky enough to have amazing conversations with various health professionals across all facets of medicine and allied health. And I knew that you would probably really enjoy being a fly on the wall to hear what we talked about. And that's how the podcast was born. And what you probably don't know is that this is a bit of a passion project. We don't have any sponsors or funding. And without your help, we won't be able to continue bringing you these great guests. So if you can please spread the word about the podcast, share it with someone who you think might benefit from the conversation that you've just listened to. Or if you can leave us a review or a comment, it would mean the absolute world, because that actually helps the podcast spread further and get more people to hear our message and hopefully allow us to invite bigger and bigger guests onto the show. And I would so appreciate you helping me back. Thank you. This podcast and any information, advice, opinions, or statements within it do not constitute medical, healthcare, or other professional advice. Information is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you have any health concerns, always consult your doctor.